Bartholomew Roberts captured over 400 ships. He did it with a rule book, not a metaphor, not a legend. An actual written document signed by his crew specifying what time the lights had to go out at night, how much a man received if he lost a limb in combat, and what happened to anyone caught stealing from the common stock. Roberts was one of the most wanted criminals in the Atlantic world. Every navy hunted him. Every government had declared men like him enemies of all mankind. And his ship ran on a constitution. That is the part of pirate history that almost nobody talks about, and it changes everything. The image most of us carry of pirates is pretty consistent. Chaos, violence without structure, men who burned civilization's rulebook the moment they sailed beyond the horizon. It makes a certain intuitive sense. If you've already decided to rob ships at gunpoint and hang from a noose if caught, what would stop you from doing exactly as you pleased? The freedom was supposed to be the point. No king, no magistrate, no one telling you when to sleep or how to divide your earnings, just open water and lawlessness. That image is not entirely wrong about what pirates were from the outside. Under international law in the early 18th century, pirates were classified as hostes humanae generis, enemies of the human race. They operated outside the protection of any state. They had no legitimate flag. Any nation could arrest, try, and execute them. In that sense, they were genuinely outside the law, and the law made its position on them perfectly clear. What the popular image gets almost completely wrong is what pirates were from the inside. The richest surviving source on this subject is Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, right at the end of what historians now call the Golden Age of piracy, roughly 1680 to 1730. Johnson is not a flawless source. His accuracy on some details is disputed, and historians treat him carefully, but he recorded something that no one is seriously disputing. Several pirate crews operated under written articles of agreement, signed by crew members, specifying the rules of the enterprise before it began. These weren't rumors. Some of those articles survive in the historical record, and the most detailed examples come from three crews: Bartholomew Roberts, George Lowther, and John Phillips. I want to be precise about what the evidence actually shows, because one of the things that gets distorted in popular retellings is the scale of the claim. There was no single universal pirate code. There was no International Pirate Congress that agreed on one set of regulations. The articles differed from crew to crew. What they share is the type of problem they were solving, and understanding that problem is the only way to understand why men who had rejected every institution still built institutions of their own. Here's the problem they were solving. A pirate ship is, at its most basic level, an extremely dangerous cooperative enterprise involving heavily armed men with no external authority to appeal to. On a legitimate merchant vessel or a naval warship, the captain's authority was backed by the state. If a merchant captain decided to pay himself 10 times what he paid his crew and beat anyone who complained, the crew had limited recourse. The institution behind the captain, the Navy, the merchant company, the Crown, would ultimately support his authority. Sailors had almost no protection against captains who were cruel, dishonest, or simply incompetent. Many of the men who ended up on pirate ships had come from exactly those conditions. They had served under captains who withheld wages, sold the crew's provisions for personal profit, punished sailors with grotesque violence for minor infractions, or simply made decisions that got men killed for no good reason. The historical record on conditions in the legitimate maritime world of the early 18th century is not gentle. Sailors were among the most exploited workers in the Atlantic economy. When those men went on the account, the contemporary phrase for turning pirate, They did not arrive at some philosophical position about freedom. They arrived at a very practical problem. Remove the state's authority, and the captain has even less reason to be fair. Without rules, the biggest, most violent man on the ship makes all the decisions and takes what he wants. That is not freedom. That is just a different kind of tyranny, and it collapses the cooperative enterprise that makes piracy work in the first place. You cannot coordinate a pursuit, execute a boarding, manage a captured prize, and maintain a fighting crew if the men below decks do not trust that their share of the reward will actually reach them. The articles were the answer to that problem. Roberts's articles, as recorded by Johnson, are worth looking at in some detail because the specificity is what makes them remarkable. Every crew member received a vote in important affairs and equal title to fresh provisions or strong liquors seized during a voyage. That provision alone, the vote, was not something most of these men had ever experienced in any institution they had belonged to. The articles also prohibited gambling for money aboard the ship. They required lights to be out by 8 in the evening unless men wanted to continue drinking on the open deck. They required all crew members to keep their pistols and cutlasses clean and ready for service. Personal quarrels between crew members were forbidden aboard ship. If two men had a dispute serious enough to require a fight, they were required to resolve it ashore with pistols and a second each, following rules Johnson describes almost like a duel. Desertion during battle was punishable by death or marooning. Theft from the common company, meaning secret appropriation of captured goods that should have gone into the shared stock, was punishable by marooning or death. And then there is the provision that I find genuinely striking. Once you understand the world these men came from, Roberts's articles specified compensation from the common stock for disabling wounds received in service. Lose an eye and you received a fixed sum. Lose a limb and you received a fixed sum. Lowther's articles set the figure for a lost limb at 150 pounds, a substantial amount. Think about what that means in context. These were men who in legitimate employment had essentially no protection against workplace injury. A sailor who lost a hand in a merchant vessel's rigging had no claim on his employer. He was discarded. The pirate articles created something that did not exist anywhere else in their economic world: a predetermined, collectively funded compensation system for combat injuries. This was not charity. It was a calculated solution to a rational problem. A man who knew he would be abandoned if he was maimed fought differently than a man who knew he would be compensated. The articles were buying something: commitment, risk tolerance, willingness to board a defended vessel, and the compensation clause was part of the price. The share structure tells a similar story. Roberts's articles specified that the captain and quartermaster each received 2 shares of any prize. Skilled officers received somewhat more than ordinary crew members, but not dramatically more. This is important because the contrast with legitimate employment was not subtle. In the merchant and naval world, the gap between the captain's share and an ordinary sailor's share was enormous. The articles deliberately compressed that gap, not out of ideology, but because a crew that believed the distribution was fair was a crew that worked together. A crew that suspected the captain was secretly enriching himself was a crew on the edge of mutiny. Here's where I want to plant something that will matter later. The articles gave the quartermaster, not the captain, responsibility for distributing property and enforcing everyday discipline aboard ship. The quartermaster was chosen by the crew. The captain's authority was enormous during combat, when decisions had to be made instantly and without debate. Outside of combat, the quartermaster was the operative power over daily life. That division of authority was written into the system deliberately. It was a structural constraint on the captain's power, built into the document before anyone signed it. Roberts was one of the most effective pirates of the entire Golden Age. He captured ships across the Caribbean, the Atlantic coast of North America, and the coasts of West Africa. The scale of his operation, over 400 vessels across a career that lasted roughly 3 years, required a functioning organization. It required men who showed up for combat, maintained their weapons, did not steal from each other, and trusted that the rewards would be distributed as promised. The articles made that possible, not perfectly. History is full of pirate crews that fell apart, captains who were deposed, men who were marooned for various violations. But the articles were the mechanism by which a collection of wanted criminals managed to cooperate long enough to become genuinely dangerous. And that is where the popular image breaks down completely. Pirates did not succeed despite having rules. In many documented cases, they succeeded because they had rules. The chaos was what they presented to their victims. Among themselves, they were running something closer to a regulated enterprise. But here's the question that the articles immediately raise. Once you accept that they existed and functioned, why would men who had escaped every institution feel compelled to recreate an institution? What is it about the specific conditions of piracy, the danger, the illegality, the isolation from any external authority, that made rules not just useful, but apparently necessary? The answer to that question goes deeper than the articles themselves. It goes into the structure of what these crews actually were, and what happened when the rules failed to solve the problem they were designed for. The quartermaster was the most important person on a pirate ship that most people have never heard of. Not the captain, not the navigator, the quartermaster, the man chosen by the crew, not appointed by tradition or the owner of the vessel, not installed by any external authority. His job was to distribute plunder, manage the ship's stores, settle minor disputes, and enforce the everyday regulations that kept the enterprise from collapsing into violence. He was, in the most direct sense, the crew's representative against the captain's potential excess. And the fact that this position existed, that it was written into the articles before the voyage began, tells you almost everything about the actual problem pirate governance was designed to solve. That problem was not disorder in the abstract. It was a very specific danger: the captain. In the legitimate maritime world of the early 18th century, a ship's captain was effectively sovereign within his vessel. The law backed him. The merchant company or the admiralty behind him backed him. A sailor who was cheated, beaten, starved, or worked to death had almost no legal recourse, and even less practical recourse, once the ship was at sea. The historical record on this is not ambiguous. Flogging was routine. Withholding wages was common. Captains who sold off the crew's provisions and pocketed the difference faced little consequence. The institutional structure of Atlantic maritime commerce was built on the assumption that absolute captainly authority was necessary for order, and the men who suffered under that authority had essentially no mechanism for relief. Many of the men who became pirates had lived that system firsthand. Bartholomew Roberts himself had served on legitimate vessels before being captured by a pirate crew and eventually choosing to join them. George Lowther had served as second mate on a Royal African Company vessel before leading a mutiny. The men writing and signing pirate articles were not theorizing about power. They were engineering solutions to conditions they had personally experienced. The quartermaster position was the central solution. When Johnson's account describes Roberts's crew granting each member a vote in important affairs, that vote mattered most in the selection of the quartermaster, because the quartermaster is the institutional check on everything the captain might otherwise do unchallenged. During combat, The captain's authority was near absolute. Speed and coordination in a boarding action required a single decision maker. But outside of combat, during the long stretches of sailing between prizes, during the division of plunder, during the resolution of disputes, the quartermaster held the operative power over daily life. The articles specified this division deliberately. Combat authority and administrative authority were separated, given to different men, accountable to different constituencies. This is the mechanism behind the vote provisions that sounds so surprisingly democratic on the surface. It was not democracy as a principle. It was democracy as an engineering solution to a specific structural vulnerability. If the captain controlled everything, he could eventually take everything. The articles prevented that by distributing authority before the voyage began in writing with every crew member's agreement. The share structure worked the same way. Roberts's articles specified the captain's 2 shares, the quartermaster's 2 shares, the somewhat elevated shares for skilled officers, and the standard shares for ordinary crew members. Every person aboard knew, before any prize was taken, exactly what fraction of the combined value they would receive. That knowledge did 2 things simultaneously. It prevented the captain from arbitrarily adjusting the distribution in his own favor after a successful capture, because the contract was already signed, and it gave every crew member a direct financial stake in the success of every boarding, every chase, every dangerous encounter with the defended vessel. The articles aligned incentives. When the ship won, everyone won according to a predetermined formula, and no one could claim they had been cheated out of what the articles promised. Lowther's articles reinforced the same pattern with slightly different numbers and provisions, which is itself important. These were not copies of one universal document. They were independent solutions to the same problem, arrived at by different crews in different circumstances. Both versions specified officer shares in advance. Both created collective punishment mechanisms for cowardice, concealed loot, and unauthorized violence against crew members. Both established the quartermaster's authority over distribution. The convergence in structure across crews that had no formal connection to each other suggests that the articles were genuinely functional responses to real operational needs rather than borrowed ideology. The wound compensation clauses deserve more attention than they usually receive because they illuminate something specific about what the articles were purchasing. Roberts's men were promised fixed payments from the common stock for disabling injuries received in service. Lowther's articles set the figure for a lost limb at 150 pounds. To understand what that meant, consider the alternative. A sailor on a legitimate vessel who lost a hand in an accident had no claim on his employer. He was discharged, often without back wages, and left to survive on whatever charity or begging he could manage. The pirate articles created a funded guarantee where none existed in the legitimate world. This was not sentiment. It was a calculated investment in the willingness of men to take lethal risks. A boarding action against a defended vessel is an extraordinarily dangerous act. Men who believed they would be compensated for injury were more willing to execute it aggressively. The articles were buying that willingness. The weapons maintenance clause worked on the same logic. Roberts's articles required pistols and cutlasses to be kept clean and ready for service. That provision sounds almost trivial until you think through what a pirate ship's operational success actually depended on. A chase that ends in a successful boarding requires every man who goes over the rail to be immediately effective. A single fouled pistol at the wrong moment, a weapon that misfires when it should stop a defender, can cost the ship the initiative, and the initiative in a boarding action is often the only thing standing between victory and catastrophic casualty. Individual negligence produced collective consequences. The rule existed because the mathematics of armed cooperation made individual readiness a shared asset. The prohibition on theft from the common company was the rule with the sharpest enforcement mechanism, and the severity, marooning, or death tells you precisely how central the problem was. The temptation to conceal a gem, a coin, a piece of jewelry from a captured prize was enormous. Detection was genuinely difficult, and the entire share system depended on the assumption that everything valuable from a captured vessel went into the common stock before distribution. A single person successfully hiding significant value from the stock effectively stole a fraction of every other crew member's share simultaneously. The articles treated this as the most serious internal threat because it was. A crew that could not trust that the common stock was intact had no reason to trust the share formula, which meant no reason to trust the articles at all. The whole structure was only as strong as the honesty of the worst thief aboard. Extreme punishment was the only mechanism available to make detection credible as a deterrent. Here is where I want to address something directly because it comes up whenever this subject is discussed seriously, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a dismissal. Some historians, most notably Marcus Rediker, in his work on Atlantic maritime history, have argued that pirate governance was not merely practical, but genuinely radical. That the articles represented a form of working-class resistance to Atlantic capitalism, an alternative social vision emerging from the people most brutalized by the system. That the vote, the compressed share ratios, the collective punishment mechanisms, and the quartermaster's authority amounted to something meaningfully democratic in a world that offered almost nothing of the kind to sailors and laborers. That argument is not without substance. The vote was real. The constraint on captainly authority was real. The compressed hierarchy compared to the extreme stratification of legitimate maritime employment was real. These are not nothing, and the men who designed the articles had lived under conditions that gave them specific and serious grievances against the concentrated authority of the legitimate maritime world. But the romantic version of this argument breaks down when you look at what the articles coexisted with. These same governed, regulated, democratically administered crews robbed ships, murdered people who resisted them, and terrorized the trade networks of the Atlantic. Some pirate crews participated in the slave trade or profited from enslaved people's labor, even while some of their own members were formerly enslaved men who had found in piracy something closer to freedom than anything the legal economy offered. The article said nothing about this. The internal equality, equal vote, equal access to provisions, predetermined shares extended precisely as far as the crew and no further. It was not a universal principle. It was an operational agreement among a specific group of armed men pursuing a specific criminal enterprise. The egalitarianism of the articles was real, and it was also strictly bounded. Historians who point this out are not wrong. Historians who call pirate governance a genuine form of democratic radicalism are capturing something real about the article's structure while missing something essential about their moral and historical context. Both things are true simultaneously, which is exactly why the subject resists clean ideological framing. Lowther's good quarters provision is a useful example of this ambiguity. His articles required the crew to offer good quarters, meaning to accept surrender, spare lives, and not massacre a crew that stopped fighting when an opponent gave up. On the surface, this looks almost chivalric. In practice, it was strategic calculation. A pirate fleet's operational efficiency depended on prizes surrendering quickly rather than defending themselves to the last man. A reputation for honoring surrender reduced resistance, reduced casualties, reduced the cost of each capture. Mercy and strategy coincided here, but the driving logic was the arithmetic of successful piracy rather than a humanitarian impulse. And yet the provision existed. Whatever the motive, the outcome, when the articles were followed, was that more people survived encounters with these crews than might otherwise have. The rules produced real-world consequences independent of whether the intention behind them was moral or purely practical. Which brings us to the structural contradiction that the articles could not solve, no matter how carefully they were written. The articles managed internal authority brilliantly. They prevented captains from becoming tyrants. They enforced fair distribution. They maintained weapons and combat readiness. They reduced destructive internal violence. What they could not do was manage the external world. And the more effectively the articles worked, the more organized, efficient, and dangerous the governed pirate crews became, the more urgently the Atlantic states needed to eliminate them. A well-regulated pirate operation was, in a direct and measurable sense, a more serious geopolitical threat than a chaotic one. And the states that felt that threat were not limited in their response by any document the pirates had written. Bartholomew Roberts died on the morning of February 10th, 1722, when a Royal Navy broadside from HMS Swallow caught him on the deck of his ship before his crew had fully cleared from the night before. His articles specified lights out at 8. Some of his men had been drinking on the open deck, which the same articles permitted. The ship that carried a written constitution was caught unprepared. Roberts was killed almost immediately. His crew, many of them hungover, were taken prisoner within hours. The irony is almost too clean, but it is documented. Johnson records it. The most governed pirate crew in the historical record, operating under the most detailed surviving set of articles, was destroyed not by internal collapse, but by the one thing the articles were never designed to address. The Royal Navy did not care about the quartermaster's authority or the share distribution formula. It had a 40-gun warship and orders to end the problem. What happened after Roberts' capture illustrates something the articles could not fix, and the crew could not vote their way out of. The surviving crew members were taken to Cape Coast Castle on the West African coast and tried under the Act for the more effectual suppression of piracy, a British statute from 1700 specifically designed to allow admiralty courts to try pirates without juries in the territories where they were captured. 52 men were hanged. Others were sentenced to hard labor or transportation. The trial records survive, and they contain something that should feel uncomfortable once you understand what was being used as evidence. The articles themselves were introduced in court, the very documents the crew had written to govern their internal conduct, to prevent tyranny, ensure fair distribution, compensate the wounded, and manage authority, became proof of organized criminal conspiracy under Admiralty law. The contract that protected crew members from their captain was read aloud as evidence that they had all knowingly and collectively agreed to engage in piracy. The governance mechanism became the instrument of their legal destruction. This is not an accident of legal history. It reflects something precise about the relationship between pirate articles and the states that hunted these crews. From inside the ship, the articles were a constitution. From outside the ship, from the perspective of a British Admiralty court, they were a conspiracy document. The same text performed two completely different legal functions depending on who was reading it. Roberts's career had ended, but the implications of what his crew had built did not disappear with him. The British response to the golden age of piracy was itself shaped by the fact that pirate crews were organized. The 1700 Act, the deployment of dedicated naval squadrons to the Caribbean and the West African coast, and the systematic use of admiralty courts without juries, these were responses to a threat that the state recognized as structured, not random. Chaotic criminals are a law enforcement problem. Organized criminals with written agreements, elected officers, compensation systems, and operational discipline are a political problem. The British government treated the pirate crews of the early 18th century as the latter, and its suppression campaign was calibrated accordingly. There is a further dimension to the legacy of these articles that sits uncomfortably alongside any idealized reading of them, and I want to address it plainly rather than bury it. Some of the men who signed pirate articles and voted in crew elections had previously been enslaved. The historical record documents black sailors and formerly enslaved men serving on pirate vessels during the Golden Age, and for some of them, a pirate ship offered something the legal Atlantic economy never would: a share of the proceeds, a vote in crew decisions, a compensation clause if they were injured. The articles did not ask about their origins. The share formula did not distinguish by race, and yet pirate crews also captured slave ships. Some kept enslaved people as property, some sold them. The historical record on this is not clean, and scholars who have examined it carefully, including Redeker and others, acknowledge the contradiction without resolving it neatly. The internal equality of the articles extended to the crew as defined by the articles. It did not extend to the people in the hold of the prize ships. The same governance document that gave a formerly enslaved crew member a vote and a share said nothing about the people his crew might take as property in the next capture. This is not a minor footnote. It is the actual moral boundary of what the articles were. They were a practical constitution for the men who signed them. They were not a statement about human equality in any broader sense. The men who wrote them were solving a specific operational problem among a specific group of armed people. Whatever the articles achieved within that group, they achieved nothing for the people outside it. Royal Museums Greenwich notes that orderly, efficiently run pirate ships improved operational success, and that observation is correct as far as the operational evidence goes. Roberts's more than 400 captures across 3 years required coordination that the articles made possible. Lowther's crew, operating under their own independent set of articles with the same structural features, ran a similar operation. The convergence of the documentary evidence is real. Governed crews were more effective than ungoverned ones, and the men who designed the articles understood this at a practical level, even if they would not have used that language. But effective at what? This is the question the popular romanticization of pirate governance tends to slide past. The articles made pirate crews more effective at robbery, at intimidation, at the violent seizure of ships and their cargoes. The operational efficiency enabled by internal democracy was the operational efficiency of a predatory enterprise. The better the governance worked, the more successful the violence it enabled. That is not a reason to pretend the articles did not exist or did not function as described. It is a reason to hold both things simultaneously. The articles were a genuine and somewhat remarkable solution to a real problem of internal governance, and they existed entirely in service of a criminal and violent enterprise. The two facts do not cancel each other out. They define each other. Here is what the popular image misses, stated as precisely as I can manage it. The romantic version, pirates as pure chaos, no rules, no masters, freedom from all social constraint, is wrong about the inside of these ships. The articles prove it wrong. These were not men who rejected all law. They were men who rejected the specific laws imposed by governments on their activities, and then discovered, immediately and practically, that they could not function without making laws of their own. The more dangerous and illegal the enterprise became, the more specific those laws had to be. Who gets what? Who can order whom? What happens when someone cheats? What happens when someone is injured? What happens when two crew members want to kill each other? The articles answered every one of those questions in writing before the voyage began, because experience, and in many cases, painful personal experience under abusive captains, had taught these men that unanswered questions in a group of armed people with competing interests produce catastrophic answers. The idealized version, pirates as proto-democratic revolutionaries, the articles as a genuine alternative social vision, the golden age of piracy as a working class challenge to Atlantic capitalism, captures something real and overstates it. The vote was real. The compressed hierarchy was real. The compensation clause was real. But the articles were less a moral vision than a practical constitution, and the limits of that constitution were the limits of the men who wrote it. Internal equality did not produce external justice. A crew that voted on everything still robbed, still murdered, still operated within, and sometimes sustained the same Atlantic colonial economy the romantic reading wants them to have escaped. The accurate version is less satisfying than either of those, and more interesting than both. Pirates were unquestionably outlaws. That is not in dispute, and nothing in the articles changes it. But outlaw was a legal status, not a description of how these ships actually functioned. Lawless was never an operational option. The moment you put 20 or 40 or 80 armed men on a ship with no external authority and ask them to cooperate on a dangerous and lucrative illegal enterprise, you have created a situation that generates rules whether anyone intends to write them down or not. Roberts and Lowther and Phillips wrote them down. They specified them, signed them, and enforced them with marooning and death when necessary. They did this not because they had a philosophy about governance, but because they had a problem that only governance could solve. Return to the image that started this. Roberts's crew holding a vote aboard a captured prize. Wanted criminals in the Atlantic world, condemned by international law, hunted by the British Navy, conducting a scheduled election under the terms of a written document they had all agreed to before the voyage began. The lights out provision, the wound compensation clause, the quartermaster chosen by the men rather than appointed by the captain, all of it operating on a ship that every government in the Atlantic world had classified as a vessel of enemies of the human race.